Do you ever look at a developing country and think to yourself, hey, I can do a better job than those leaders? They're all corrupt and clueless, and they don't care about the development and well-being of the country. Well, if you ever thought that, then you've come to the right place. Here in the West, developing countries are often not mentioned in the media or otherwise. If they are, it's usually about some type of problem they have. Every now and again, a country might make the news if there's an election, when we're told about a progressive candidate who promises to put all children in schools and to give health care for everybody, and so on and so forth. However, this type of candidate always seems to lose, and even if they win, they don't seem to get anything done. So why is that? Well, let's take a closer look. A lot of people would say that elected officials are the most corrupt. But according to Transparency International, which releases its Global Corruption Barometer, which is a worldwide survey in which citizens from all over the world are asked to rank corrupt professions, politicians finished third. So who is the most corrupt? The number one spot is tightly contested between the police and judges. In other words, the top two most corrupt jobs are in law enforcement. Add in the politicians to round out the top three, and you have an unstable system where people don't feel safe. And that's the main point. People do not feel safe in their own countries. So you can propose to have these education reforms and health reforms, but if people do not feel safe going outside, they will never vote for that. The number one thing you have to do is to ensure safety and regulate law enforcement. Therefore, you should run a campaign outlining exactly that. Show how corrupt the country's been, and point the finger at the people in charge for allowing this to happen. This is exactly what Jair Bolsonaro did in Brazil. Like him or hate him, he effectively ran a campaign based on anti-corruption and increasing security, and he won. The party he was up against was in power for nearly 20 years. People had the impression that the establishment and big businesses were on the side of that party, so the people voted for Bolsonaro instead. Another important thing is to use memorable quotes that will get people talking. These quotes do not have to be true at all. During the Brexit campaign, pro-Brexiters used a big red box, where they would put quotes such as £350 million per week going to the EU. Let's use that for the NHS instead. These quotes were easily debunked, but that didn't matter, as all that people remembered were the quotes themselves, not the debunking of the quote.
Is that we send £350 million a week to the EU, which could be spent on the NHS. But it's important to recall that the UK does get a rebate as well as money back in grants, which leaves the real figure at around £161 million a week. So was he prepared to admit this was all more than a bit misleading?
Let's deal with your arguments. One of them is on the side of this bus. We send 350 million to Europe. We don't, and you know we don't. No, we don't. You know we don't.
No,
Admit that figure is grotesquely misleading at best.
I won't. I'll tell you why not. Because that figure represents accurately the gross sum that is sent.
But the gross sum is meaningless. You've got the rebate, you've got the public subsidy, so the true sum is 161 million, as best as anyone can get to it. Right?
Which is not in itself to be sneezed at.
Okay, but that is the right figure.
But let me tell you why.
So you're wandering around this country with a dirty great lie on the side of your bus.
Memorable quotes are important. Most people will not bother doing research to be more informed. They just look at the news at the end of the day. So even if your outrageous claim is false, they likely won't listen to people debunking it. All they'll remember is you appearing on the news and being passionate. Hence, voters rely on news and slogans. If you get people talking about you by saying something outrageous, then you're doing a good job. That's basically free advertising.
Hitler massacred 3 million Jews. Now, there's a 3 million drug addicts. There are. I'd be happy to slaughter them. At least, if Germany had Hitler, the Philippines would have, but, my victims, I would like to be all criminals to finish the problem of my country and save the next generation from perdition.
This works in developed countries, developing countries, basically anywhere, because what they have in common is that most citizens don't want to be more informed. So congratulations on your incredible victory. But if you want to stay in power, you should probably try fixing some of the issues you campaigned on. You see, many political leaders will stay in power for a very long time if they solve their country's issues. For example, after Singapore solved its issues, Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew stayed in power for nearly 30 years, from 1960 to 1990. In Botswana, Seretse Khama was in power from 1966 to 1980, and currently in Rwanda, Paul Kagame has been in power since 2000. And in all three countries, there is little opposition to those three leaders. They each contributed to the reduction of corruption, which led to more prosperous times. And because there was less corruption, businesses were more likely to want to invest in that country, as it became easier to do business. In other words, there was less bureaucratic red tape. It's crucial to note that a democracy is not the most important part for economic growth. Rather, it's tackling corruption, which is the gateway towards transitioning from a developing to a developed country. This means that even a one-party state can do this, so long as it tackles corruption, and might in fact be more effective provided that the right leader is in power, which is never a guarantee, and not a risk that many people would be willing to take. So once you're elected, how do you solve the issue of corruption? Well, let me take you back. The year is 1951. Singapore was once a place where corruption was thriving, a far cry from the current landscape. Its ports were a key point in the underground drug trade between India and China. Then, boom, police officers were discovered to be involved in stealing shipments of opium and were a key player in the drug trade. This would become known as the opium hijacking scandal. The real controversy, however, was that investigators failed to convict any of the police officers. The British, who controlled Singapore at the time, before they became an irrelevant, smelly island with terrible food, I mean a toast sandwich, what the hell is that? And this is the same place that considers cold beans on soggy bread to be a delicacy. Anyway, they created the Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau, or the CPIB. But this was largely ineffective, as they did not have enough power to prosecute wrongdoers. Once Singapore obtained self-governance, they revamped the CPIB, making it an independent institution with a lot of power and authority to investigate corruption. They were allowed to pursue anybody without fear of reprisal, as well as the ability to detain people. This was controversial, as they're giving an organization a lot of power to do basically whatever they want, but it was a necessary measure in a time of instability and corruption. Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew was also instrumental in changing the culture's perception towards corruption. In fact, during his inauguration, he made his party officials wear white uniforms to symbolize the purity and incorruptibility of its members. This is to say that you need a strong cultural movement as well in order to stigmatize corruption. And this worked. The increase in power for the CPIB meant that they could stop illegal activities in which many police officers were involved. As a result, the police force was no longer above the law, and its members could now be brought to justice. Indeed, the takedown of police officers and state ministers embroiled in corruption scandals showed not only the will of the government to tackle corruption, but also served to stigmatize it. For example, a state minister was found to have accepted bribes for a large corporation, and committed suicide as a result, writing in a letter that he felt shame for betraying the pride and trust of the nation. This would not have happened 10 years ago. By changing the laws, they managed to change the people's outlook. The implementation of harsh penalties and fines were put in place to discourage and lower the rewards of corruption. Even those who lived at the time when corruption was widespread, such as the minister, now viewed it as shameful. This shows that a strong political will from a leader with a vision for the country is an important first step towards stigmatizing corruption and eliminating it. Singapore also created the Public Service Commission, which separated politics from civil servants. The goal of this was to enforce a meritocracy, so that they could have the best and brightest work for the country in public sector jobs, while at the same time cracking down on favoritism, nepotism, and patronage. However, to incentivize these workers to choose public sector jobs rather than go in the private sector, the government increased salaries for public service workers. This might be hard to do if a country doesn't have a lot of money to begin with, but it's worth noting that Singapore was also not very rich. In fact, they were part of Malaysia for 2 years, but got kicked out of Malaysia due to ethnic tensions and because Singapore was too poor. Anyway, the expulsion of Malaysia prompted the PM Lee to cry on live TV.
You see, the whole of my adult life, I had believed in Malaysian merger and the unity of these two territories. You know, as a people connected by geography, economics, and ties of kinship, would you mind if we stop for a while?
Whilst political will remains one of the most effective ways to stop corruption, it's not the only way. Indeed, the system of meritocracy allowed them to employ the best and brightest in the public sector, and the government increased salaries to match those of the private sector in order to incentivize good workers to pursue a career in public service. Moreover, these measures of hiring the best worker for the public sector have led to an increase in firms' performances, as well as a net profit margin, which increased by about 12.8% between 1995 and 2013, due in part to the elimination of a lot of bureaucratic red tape. This means that corporations are more likely to do business in that country, since it is easier and more productive for them. On the other hand, you have a country like the Philippines. They actually tried getting a private company to investigate corruption as well, but it didn't last. You see, the Dutch company they hired was very effective in finding corruption, but the problem is that they were Dutch. Because they were foreigners, they were not trusted by the public, regardless of how effective they were. As a result, the project was abandoned after less than 2 years. This shows that many of these countries don't like foreigners taking jobs that could be accomplished by people from their own country. Therefore, implementing a unified and comprehensive anti-corruption strategy will lead to a change in the culture and perception of corruption in a country like the Philippines. People will begin to perceive that corruption is high-risk, low-reward activity. This results in a cultural shift in the attitudes of its people. Of course, certain issues vary by country. For instance, Nigeria should be one of the richest countries in the world due to their oil, but a crumbling infrastructure of the oil sector combined with an unwillingness to fix anything has doomed Nigeria. Issues like this will persist until you eliminate corruption and hire competent workers to manage these issues. So before you can solve economic issues, you have to first get rid of corruption. This doesn't mean that you shouldn't invest in things like education. You should invest in primary education because primary education yields the highest returns on society. Children are able to develop their social, cognitive, cultural, and emotional skills in primary education. They also learn about societal norms and the difference between what's right and what's wrong, which has a great impact in the long run as it reduces crime, more so than secondary or university education could. Therefore, you should focus on primary education rather than secondary or university education. In conclusion, once you're elected, you have to create a task force that's above the law, hire workers from your own country, give them a good salary to attract the best and brightest so that they won't work elsewhere, try to eliminate as much bureaucratic red tape as possible to improve the ease of doing business, and voila, corruption defeated. It may not be all that easy, as you're bound to encounter some opposition, obviously by some corrupt folks, but it is evident that reducing corruption is the single greatest factor in transitioning towards becoming a developed country.